Hello, I'm your host, Ray Dogum, and welcome to VibeCast. Thank you for joining us as we explore the exciting advancements in technology-enabled collaboration to excel important drug development. Vibe Bio seeks to find every cure for every community. We think big as no one should be left behind in the pursuit of living a healthy, happy, and productive life free from disease. VibeCast is our weekly informational podcast where we explore some of the hottest topics in drug development and technology innovation with some of the dynamic people that make up the Vibe community. Join us to learn, imagine, question, and help us identify and develop solutions together. Our guest today is Alice Valder Curran, an experienced regulatory expert and strategic advisor to multinational pharmaceutical and biotech companies. Alice is a partner at Hogan Lovells and earned her JD at Columbia Law School. Alice, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Great. Thanks, Ray. Lovely to be here.
If you wouldn't mind giving a introduction about yourself to the audience as well?
Sure. So my name's Alice Valder Curran. I'm a partner at Hogan Lovells, as you noted, and my practice focuses on drug pricing in both the arcane and the strategic ways that it impacts pharma and biotechnology companies. I started my career out actually working at the Department of Justice doing enforcement work, and then came over to what was then Hogan and Hartson and left litigation and gradually became a regulatory lawyer over time with a focus on drug pricing work.
Awesome. I appreciate that. And, having seen both the working at the government and working in a private firm, you've probably seen a lot of different cases, lots of different technologies, lots of different drugs. So you've been through a lot of different experiences. But there's one thing that you're also doing that you didn't mention, which is you're on the board of the No Patient Left Behind organization. So you want to briefly talk about that as well?
Sure. I joined the board of No Patient Left Behind earlier this year, and I'm really delighted to have that opportunity to serve. No Patient Left Behind really has 4 goals, one of which is about ensuring that patients have access to products and that there's insurance reform without a requirement for out-of-pocket costs, that products are available on a generic basis and in a way that is not unduly delayed, making sure that there is still incentives in the marketplace for innovation, among other things. And I was really delighted to join because that group of people really marries the patient service of the pharma and biotechnology industry with making sure that patients can actually access those therapies so that they can have the effect that everyone spends so much time and money making sure gets to the market.
I appreciate that. And, something else that you didn't mention is, I'd like to mention myself here, is that Financial Times recently recognized you with an award for most innovative legal practitioner. So what part of your work are you most proud of?
So that was around work that we delivered with 4 gene therapy companies to enable value-based pricing in the Medicaid program. And what was so great about that, in summary, I would say, is that the innovation of these gene therapies led to innovation in policy development. And there's this concept of best price in Medicaid that requires a drug company to give Medicaid a rebate or a discount equal to the lowest price they make available to any commercial customer. And for gene therapy companies and cell therapy companies as well that are interested in giving performance-based discounts. So the product either works or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, you get a significant discount or up to maybe even a full refund. The companies are willing to do that, but they don't want to have to give that refund to Medicaid when the drug does work. But the Medicaid program didn't have a way of right-sizing that. So it was structured as saying if you give 100% or a significant discount to anyone on any unit, you have to give it to Medicaid on every unit, even if they work. And so what we did is my partner Ken Cho and I came up with an innovative way to interpret this 30-plus-year-old statutory scheme to enable variable pricing based on performance. We then teamed with 4 different gene therapy manufacturers that were willing to go to the Centers of Medicare and Medicaid Services and say, we are interested in pursuing this sort of value-based arrangement. And then, as importantly, we had stakeholders and leaders within the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services that likewise were really interested in facilitating a pathway for value-based pricing arrangements in the Medicaid program. We all came together, and as the case with all innovation, we iterated. We had ideas, there were problems, we iterated and made it better, got more feedback, iterated some more, did a lot of soundings, And it really was up to the leadership of CMS to say, we agree that this can work. And then to see that culminate in it being adopted in regulation was a highlight of my career. And oftentimes, I work with these companies after the scientists have done the magic, right? And it is such a privilege to be able to work with these incredibly smart people to develop these therapies that are biblical and sometimes in their curative nature, and to be able to be inspired by that, to be able to work on policy innovation and create this new pathway was immensely rewarding.
Yeah, it's amazing what kind of technologies are coming out these days. There's so many different platforms for drug delivery, drug development, and with the release of AI, you can say it's becoming even more complex, let's put it. And I think the drug pricing strategies that companies are taking on is becoming even more complicated, I think. But
well, I think the challenge is that we have a really complicated regulatory scheme that the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, has just made even more complicated. One of the things we were exchanging communications about was how did we come to have the drug pricing regulatory landscape that we have in this country? And it started over 30 years ago. I mean, it started in 1990 with the enactment of the Medicaid drug rebate statute, 91, I believe. And I want the listeners and viewers to think about, if they were even alive then, what the pharmaceutical market looked like in 1990 when Congress was working on this and it was enacted in 1991. People got their prescriptions at corner pharmacies. They were, almost certainly solid oral dosage forms. Injectables were, insulin and very few others. We didn't have PBMs. We didn't have significant drug benefits as part of our health plans. And that's what the Medicaid drug rebate program was built around, was that marketplace. And it hasn't been materially revised since then, which is why you can understand why that 30 plus year old regulatory or statutory scheme couldn't accommodate value-based pricing for gene and cell therapies, right? So you have that. And the next big change is in 2004 when you have Part B, Medicare Part B drugs, so physician-administered drugs for the elderly and disabled, where you have to start reporting average sales price or ASP for those drugs. 2010, you have the Part D benefit coming into effect, and then you have the Affordable Care Act, which updated the statute, and now we have the IRA. And all of these statutory amendments are bolt-ons to sort of what started with Medicaid, which was built on a marketplace that does not exist anymore. And so we have these amazing therapies that are in the pipeline or that have come to market. And developers understandably want to make sure that those products are priced and contracted in a way that reflect their value and how they're administered and how they treat patients. But they have to do so within this regulatory construct that is definitely outdated based on a bunch of other assumptions that no longer exist and certainly don't contemplate the kinds of therapies we're talking about. And so for companies today that are bringing products to market, requires a lot of forethought around how their market access strategy can work within this archaic, in some ways, regulatory scheme that was not built for today's therapies.
Do you think it would make more sense to sort of transform the whole model internally? Is it even possible? I mean, I'm sure there are people talking about this or demanding that we like revolutionize the way drugs are priced and paid for in this country. But realistically, is that something that lawmakers are talking about?
No, they're not.
Okay.
I mean, it was hard enough for Congress to get the IRA passed. That was an enormous lift, of course. And when I'm talking about the drug price negotiation provisions in particular, there are some other pricing provisions in there as well, including some important and helpful provisions around Part D reform. But no, sort of going back to a clean slate and figuring out how to make it simpler. There are a lot of constituencies that would be concerned about that. You sort of build your model around what you know and what the status quo is. And so stepping back and saying, let's wipe the slate clean and start over is hard. And that assumes you even have a Congress that's functional enough to do it, which we don't.
That's fair. Yeah, I don't think PBMs would be interested in that either. So,
well, they have a system, right? They have a system and they know how to make money with that system. And so That's why people have these bolt-ons where you build on the infrastructure you have because you know how to work within it.
What are like the top three most important FDA or CMS pricing policies in place now that you think needs to be updated to actually align with our current uh, medical technology?
So the first thing I'll say about that question, Ray, is that um, the FDA in general says pricing is not its issue, right? Safety and
Okay.
efficacy is. They say that's CMS's job, which CMS agrees it's its job, but a lot of the pricing statutes that we have reference FDA regulatory standards. So they are those FDA standards are necessarily a part of any pricing scheme that CMS implements. CMS, for its part, in general, acknowledges these FDA standards are relevant, but also makes clear that they aren't necessarily constrained by those FDA standards. You know, the way FDA defines a term isn't necessarily the way that Medicare or Medicaid is going to define that term. So there's before I give you those three, I sort of want to note the fraught nature that you have these two agencies that are incredibly important, you know, the most important to our industry, but that I think do talk to each other, but and I think in the future will work even more collaboratively, but it's still unclear exactly what that working relationship looks like. So with that, the three issues that I would identify um, are indication-based pricing, value-based pricing, and also more generally multi-orphan indication products and the treatment of them, particularly under the Inflation Reduction Act. I'm going to take those out of order and start with value-based pricing, right? So particularly with cell and gene therapies, which often have a very high price tag, but also often deliver curative impacts. So are more likely to have one and done treatments. So they have a single big price tag for reason and for cause. The developers of those therapies and the payers of those therapies, where the prices are tied to the often very strong durability and efficacy data, want to stand behind the price tag of those therapies, and so want to be able to offer big discounts, if not refunds, if they don't work. As I mentioned, we found a way to do that for Medicaid. That's now in regulation. We don't yet have a clear pathway for doing that with Medicare Part B therapies, which are typically oncolytics or autoimmune or transplant products that are physician administered. This value-based pathway that Medicaid created and codified in regulation, it's not clear that translates over to the ASP world. So average sales price, which is the price that manufacturers have to report for Part B drugs. So I would say for value-based therapies, we've made progress. We see some of these arrangements in the marketplace. CMS is trying to enable them. We need to see more, and we need to figure out a way, they need to figure out a way to make a clearer pathway for that with Part B drugs. I grouped the other two together, indication-based pricing and multi-orphan products under the IRA, because they both deal with the topic of you have an approved therapy and you end up having multiple uses for it, okay? And oftentimes those uses have a different price or value in the marketplace. And so a manufacturer, if it has a molecule that they know in general is safe, and so you're not going to have toxicity issues in the patient population, you get it approved for one use, and then you realize it actually can treat a separate disease or a separate problem, but it has a different price. Right now, there are real barriers to being able to do that under both Medicaid and Medicare. And that's also sort of value related, right? Because the differential price that you want to have for these different indications or different uses, you want to reflects the different values that they deliver for those different disease states. So, and there are real barriers to that for both Medicaid and Medicare populations. And then the multi-orphan challenge, which I know is particularly relevant, I think, to your listeners who are often focused on rare diseases and conditions, is something that is newly problematic, I would say, under the Inflation Reduction Act. So the Inflation Reduction Act, as everyone may know, is this watershed piece of legislation that Congress enacted last summer that enables the Medicare program for the very first time to negotiate prices for the top spend drugs in Medicare and Medicare. There is an exception for orphan drugs from being subject to negotiation or, frankly, it's a price control. But that exception only applies if the product is subject to a single orphan designation and all approved indications are for that single orphan designation. But as is often the case with therapies that treat orphan diseases, is that historically developers have found that they can treat more than one orphan disease or condition. And if that happens, and if a manufacturer going forward does that, they lose the exemption from being subject to price controls, which is going to create a significant disincentive for a developer to pursue that second orphan disease. And that is something that I think is a real challenge for these, for this population of patients. And the IRA's really created a barrier there.
Yeah, that's really disappointing to hear that becomes a indirect result from the IRA. I mean, I don't know too much about all the details related to drug pricing from that act, but what kind of solutions can you think of, or what are people talking about as a way to resolve that issue? Because it doesn't make, to me, in a practical sense, that doesn't make any sense, right? It's like, if there's a drug that's safe and we know it's safe, why can't we get it out there and at an affordable rate for patients?
Well, there's nothing that prevents manufacturers from doing so, but the way the statute works is that a product is subject to price controls potentially at 9 years after approval if it's a small molecule, 13 years after approval if it's a large molecule. Now, the first barrier there is that clearly incentivizes large molecules over small molecules. And so the number one fix that a lot of people are talking about to the IRA is making both of those 13 years. There shouldn't be a reason to incentivize large molecule injectable drugs when orals are so much easier for patients to take and often tolerate. So there's a large push to do that. The way the orphan exception works is for that, you're out, you're not subject to negotiation. But let's say at year 5 or 6 post-approval, a manufacturer were to get a second orphan designation and for a product and get an indication approved, it could immediately be subject to price controls at year 9. Because that 9 or 13-year clock starts from the very first approval, even if that first approval was exempted. And so if I'm a developer and I get the first orphan designation and indication approved, and because I'm not going to, I then pivot to the second indication, but once that's approved, I could be subject to price controls in a couple of years. The economic incentives of the Orphan Drug Act are sort of nullified, right? Because I'm not getting 7 years of market exclusivity for that second indication. I may get it, but I'm subject to price controls anyway, as soon as 9 years from the very first indication is approved. So it's not that the manufacturer can't do it. It's just that the economic incentives to do it are effectively gutted. And that's a real challenge because there are a number of therapies out there where they're multi-orphans. And those are going to be hugely challenging under the IRA going forward.
It's especially challenging, I think, for the smaller biotech companies, like big pharmaceutical companies. They might have the resources to still develop the drug for other indications and kind of grow their market that way and take the monetary hit, so to speak. But it'd be worth it to them. But I think for some biotech companies, they it might be like a matter of existing or not in the next year or two. So it's kind of interesting situation they might be in.
Well, and it's why if you are a preclinical or near clinical biotech, if you haven't sat down and mapped out how the IRA is going to affect your products, you need to do that. And it's not that complicated. And it's not, from an outside legal support, it's not particularly expensive. But you need to do that. And you need to do that so that you're making purposeful decisions. Like, are you going to pursue that second indication through clinical trials now? Or are you going to shelve it for now? There might be a way to out license it and let someone else develop it. That can be complicated too. But if someone else develops it, that might have a different 9-year clock than if you develop it. Now, as I said, there's some complexities around out licensing things by indication, but like one of the mantras I have with clients I work with is purposeful decision making. Let's not discover this challenge to the commercialization of a second orphan indication when you're in your phase 3s, right? And all of a sudden you realize that your runway before you're subject to price controls is 3 years, not 7. And it's like, so that's why, if these companies are filled with really smart people, because the hardest part here is the science. And so if you can master that science, you can master the IRA. Once you understand what those rules are, you just need to make sure you're forcing yourself to do that up front. Not only, internally, but that sort of analysis is going to be really critical to anyone who's looking to invest in your company as well. They're going to want to know if you've thought about how the IRA and market access and pricing considerations more broadly are affecting our portfolio.
Really interesting. So when would you say should early biotech companies start thinking about this? I know you mentioned like start figuring out how the IRA is going to impact them very early on, but like how early is that?
Oh, I would do it before you start your phase 1s if you can.
Before.
Again, it's not a huge project. In fact, we did a short paper around the JP Morgan conference in January of this year, my partner Beth Roberts and I, around the IRA and how it affects portfolios and the like. And at the end of that, and I'll send you the link separately and you can post it. At the end of that paper is an overstatement. It's like 3 pages. We have a really simple grid that just says, this is how you should map out for each product in your portfolio. And it's literally, what are the different indications you're developing? What's the time frame for that? What's the payer mix for each of those indications? What's your dosing regimen and what's your pricing? Recognizing it's a decade away, right? But like if you were thinking about it today, how do you see yourself pricing? Is every indication priced the same? Is the dosing different for the indications? Do you have any sense of that? And if you just do that exercise, someone like me or other people who do this can look at it and say, these are the challenges, these are the tensions, or not. So it's not a super intense exercise. And as I said, once you start getting a handle on the levers, it will make sense because these folks are really smart and they're smarter than I am. And if I can figure this out, they can figure it out too.
I appreciate that. And I'm sure the listeners also appreciate that. So do you think, having that framework in mind, let's say they early on try to figure out what their pricing would look like, their payer mix and all of that, what are still some of the pitfalls that you're seeing? Even after they do all that, they think they got it all under control and, they looks like they checked all the boxes, but what else are they like forgetting about? What are some of like those?
Sure. So again, it's if they want to have differential pricing for the different indications, some of the things that they might want to think about are pursuing different NDAs or BLAs for those different applications, right? The FDA has guidance around when you can get different application NDAs or BLAs for different uses of the product. And so it is a nice option. It is an alternative option. It's sort of often outside the PBM rubric as well. It's dealing with folks that, don't, have plans with very high deductibles or are very narrow in scope. And so I think it's important that those folks have access to these products that often are multi-source or generic at a low price. In fact, one of the things that No Patient Left Behind really focuses on in terms of how you value therapies today is that you make sure and include in the valuation of the product today the value it will deliver once it is generic. And one of the founders of No Patient Left Behind, Peter Kolchinsky, refers to the generic armamentarium, and it's a great descriptor of these products that once they've gone generic and you can get them, whether through one of those new business models that you reference, Ray, or just through your regular health insurance plan for a $5 copay. I mean, being able to get a statin for a $10 copay, when you think about the health impacts that has, is incredible. And so thinking about the cost to value ratio once a product goes generic, and making sure you're considering that when you're thinking about the price you're paying it for that period before it's generic is something that they've done some analysis around and is really informative and helpful. So in general, anything that gets these particularly multiple source products to patients at low out-of-pocket costs is important, and No Patient Left Behind, thinks it's really important that we also have insurance plans that are providing drug therapies to patients with no out-of-pocket costs as well. So those are all for the good. And, I just think we all have to step back and think about, how would you feel if your kid had strep throat and you couldn't get them amoxicillin? I mean, we take that many of us take that for granted, but people have to realize that sometimes is a decision people have to make, and that's a generic product that shouldn't cost that much. And that is the practical reality for too many people in this country.
Right. And now I keep hearing about drug shortages. So it's kind of interesting to see how that affects pricing. And in some cases it doesn't, but I feel like it should, just because of market dynamics.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of the shortages we hear about these days are of multiple source drugs that are complicated to make. And because they're multiple source, you can have a lot of competition that drives the margin down. And the margin becomes so low, people exit the market. And so you have very few manufacturers of the product. So if you have any supply problems, you all of a sudden have a shortage. And again, just going back to the IRA for a moment, the typical model for generic, because the IRA, I actually think, could risk greater shortages, and I'll explain why. So the IRA clearly gives manufacturers of innovative products a choice. You can either have price controls after a certain period of time, or you can have generics. And if you have generic competition, and typically you're not going to have price controls. But if you don't have generics, you're going to have price controls. Once those, the generic market, those manufacturers want to come to market, be able to compete with a product that is priced at WAC, right? At the branded company WAC, which is typically fairly high, because they want to compete against that price, undercut it some, and still make a hefty profit margin, right? What we're going to start seeing with the IRA, I'm concerned, is that price controls are put in place before a generic can enter the market, okay? Because the price control coming into place, the way the timing can work, it absolutely can occur before generic entry. Well, if I'm a generic company and I have to decide whether to bring a generic to market, it's a very different economic calculus if I'm competing with a price control price versus a very high WAC. And so I'm concerned.
Can you explain what WAC is?
Sure. WAC is wholesale acquisition cost. It's the list price that brand companies charge for their products before discounts. It's sort of their list price, but it is the price at which they sell it as an initial matter into the market, but it's going to reflect what that branded company views as the value of the product. And that's the price, because it's the highest price that you're going to see in the market, that generic companies want to compete against and undercut a little, but not have to compete a lot. The price controls we're going to see put in place under the IRA are going to be materially lower than that. And that's really going to create a different economic calculus for generic companies. Now, why does that matter? It matters because the generic companies are the ones that make all these multiple source products. And the money that they make by competing against these high-priced generics is part of what enables them to make these multi-source products. And I worry that we're going to see some thinning of the generic industry, who play a really important role in getting low-cost pharmaceuticals to manufacturers. Now, this is tea leaf reading. We don't know if that's what's going to happen, but I do worry that the economic incentives for generic companies could be constrained by the IRA as an unintended consequence, I think, of that. And if we have fewer generic companies, we're going to have more supply issues and more shortage issues, I expect.
It's so interesting. You think our supply chain systems are so well designed, and we were able to create a vaccine in like a year or two, and it just seems kind of odd. But I get how the disincentives sort of play out that way. So there's not too much we could do, except for legislate and work towards change and listen to people and figure out how we can make it better.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really glad that you raised the vaccine example, because I think it's important that our country recognize, at least my viewpoint is, that the reason the United States had the first vaccines and had a number of vaccines is because we have the leading biotechnology industry in the world, because this country and this population has invested in that industry. And so we benefited from that in an incredibly concrete way during the pandemic because of the abundance of vaccine options on the time scale you noted. And so other countries didn't have that because they didn't have that infrastructure. And so we do need to be mindful that this is a truly amazing incubator of cures in this country. And part of that is this pricing infrastructure. And we need to be careful with how we tinker with that.
Absolutely. And like you said, even in the 90s, if you think about how medicines were delivered, much more limited. The technologies weren't all there. Now it's gotten so much better with cell therapies, gene therapies, and CRISPR, and there's a lot of other things too, RNA. And in 25 years from now, it's hard to even imagine what types of therapies will be available to humans. It'll be such a interesting world, I think. And pricing, kind of a huge question mark on pricing there.
Yeah, I mean, because so much of how pricing works is dependent upon how the insurance market works, right? And so in the last 30
we made a lot of money last year and the year before, but yeah.
And so it's not just about the therapies, but it's also about how the government payers evolve over time to pay for those, and how private payers evolve over time to pay for those. And that will matter.
Definitely. And I think we could take a moment to just appreciate the progress we are making, though. Although it's not perfect, there has been a lot of progress, and I think that's important to recognize. And I just want to thank you for the work that you're doing in this space. I think it's important to keep, people like you at the forefront and help these policymakers understand the ramifications of what they're doing. So I appreciate that very much. I think we covered this question, but if not, let's cover it real quick. What do you look for in market access and lifecycle management modeling of early stage biotech companies?
Yeah, and that goes back to sort of that grid I talked about, which is have an answer, right? So have an answer as to what your market access strategy is going to be, because your investor is going to answer that. And you want to be able to demonstrate that you've actually thought about it. So if your product, what your payer mix is, if you have your therapies that you're going to replace or therapies that you're going to compete with, how they price it. And as I said, if you have multiple indications or different dosing regimens you want to use, you've thought about what that's going to do. And then everyone has to be able to say what the IRA is going to mean for their product. Now, I want to pause on that for a minute, because one thing I haven't made clear to your listeners and viewers is that the IRA only imposes price controls on products that have a sizable Medicare spend, right? And a lot of times,
what is sizable?
At least $200 million. Now, okay. And a lot of certain classes of orphan and rare disease products, as well as others, don't have, they're Medicaid, they're pediatric populations. We talked about that at the beginning. So if you have a product that is not a big Medicare product, it's Medicaid instead, the IRA is not your challenge. But you want to be able to say that. You want to be able to say, listen, we expect our patient population to be Medicaid, not Medicare, so we just don't see the IRA as being an issue. But if you are treating a population that has any sort of sizable Medicaid component, or Medicare component, frankly, moderately successful products are going to trigger that $200 million threshold. And the way the IRA works is every year the government adds more products to the price control list. Okay. Starts with 10 the first year, 15 the second year, 20 the second year. And so by the time the folks today who are in clinical trials, by the time their 9 or 13 years is up, CMS is going to be at that $200 million threshold, because they're going to have worked down the list of expenditures because it's cumulative. And so you can't say, I'm not going to ever have to worry about it because I might just be at 200 million, because that could be enough by the time your product gets to 9 or 13 years. So yeah.
Good point.
You just need to have a market access, and you need to be able to be fluent in it to some extent.
Alice, thank you for sharing your time today and doing a deep dive on pricing for drugs, Medicare, Medicaid, and I'm looking forward to keeping in touch. And is there anything else you want to share with the community before we wrap up here?
Sure. We haven't talked a lot about the patient community and the impact they can have. And I want to be clearly on the bandwagon that patient groups are important and have an impact. One of the most important things you can do is to make sure that the developers of your therapies and the payers of your therapies know the full complement of impacts that this therapy is going to have on your life and on society. Right now, I really worry that folks value products based on the impact on the individual patient and on the individual patient's function, and that's the beginning and end of it. And if you're a caregiver or you're a relative of a patient who has one of these rare diseases or conditions or some other condition, you know the impact it's going to have on your life. There are impacts on scientific innovation because scientists see a development that works in one therapy and that enables them to think about how to use that same technology or approach for others. We call that scientific spillover. There are things like community spillover where because patients are cured or have lesser impacts because of a therapy, resources are freed up to help those who don't yet have that therapy. So there are a lot of different ways, again, that are important to measuring the cost effectiveness of therapies. And the folks who are in the best position to inform that analysis are the folks that are on the front lines of the day-to-day treatment and care of patients who are struggling. And so you have a really important voice. You can have an impact. And the one thing I learned through that experience around getting that value-based pricing option available through Medicaid is, you can have an impact. It's easy to say, I'm just me, I'm just sitting at home. What impact can I have? You can have an impact. And so make sure that you believe in what you know to be true and you find a way to share that with the right folks.
I totally agree. And I've spoken to many patients and families who are suffering, really suffering with different rare diseases. And, oftentimes there's either no ability or they have this feeling of no ability to reach out to anyone. And they're sort of stuck with, either just their Facebook communities. They want to be able to reach out to, people like you or legislators and say, hey, this, change this policy. We need these drugs, lower the pricing. How would you, what are maybe top 3 ways they can do this? What are some of the ways you've seen patient and different patient communities enable or, empower themselves to do this?
Well, you've named a few, right? So I would start with the key trade groups that focus on this, whether it's NORD is one, obviously, for orphan and rare diseases, the manufacturer trades, or even in your state, look your state around the options you have there. You just have to keep on finding or searching until you find the folks that are your people. But don't give up. And then I would also reach out to the manufacturers that are developing those therapies. I remember working with a manufacturer a year or so ago that was dealing with an issue where how they were handling it was directly driven by the patient group and what the patient group needed. And it was for a rare or orphan condition. And that was what was directing what they were doing. And so you can reach out, as I said, to the trades, whether it's disease specific or on the manufacturer developer side. You should definitely reach out to the developers as well. And then, remember that our Bill of Rights includes the right to petition your government. And so that right to petition your government is reaching out to your legislator, whether at the state level or at the federal level, to say, I have this problem. What are the resources? Help me find those resources. And helping you connect with the right component of federal government or state government is something that is constituent service for your representative or member or senator. And that's what they're supposed to do. So if you don't know where to start, all of those are options where those organizations can give you a steer and give you more options for where you can try to get traction.
Well said. That's perfect. So I'm going to leave your LinkedIn URL also in the description. So please, if you're listening or watching, make sure to check that out if you want to reach out to Alice directly. And yeah, again, Alice, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And I hope that people listening got something out of this. And remember to everyone like, share, and subscribe so others can also have the opportunity to watch this too. So thanks.
Thank you, Ray. It's been my pleasure.